Brothers and sisters, lean in for a moment. Picture an old Jamaican chapel on a warm Sunday evening. The wooden benches creaking softly beneath the weight of elders who have carried whole histories inside their hearts. The ceiling fan turns slowly, pushing the scent of frankincense across the room, and the choir has just taken their seats. Silence settles, deep and expectant. Then an elderly Jamaican pastor rises. His hands tremble slightly, not from weakness, but from the heaviness of the message resting upon his spirit. He looks at his congregation as though seeing not just the people before him, but the entire Caribbean stretched out across generations. "My children," he begins, voice low and steady. "Last night, a vision came to me. And when I tell you what I saw, some of you will feel your bones remember truths you thought you had forgotten." Those sitting at the back lean forward. The church doors rattle with a sudden breeze, as if the island itself is listening. And what this pastor reveals tonight will leave Jamaica, the Caribbean, and the wider diaspora without words. Before we walk deeper into this prophecy, brothers and sisters, if you feel the weight of this moment, do stay with us and do consider subscribing. Brothers and sisters, on that humid Jamaican evening, when the lamps flickered against the chapel walls and the scent of old hymn books lingered in the air, something stirred inside the sanctuary. Pastor Morgan, the old Jamaican shepherd whose voice had steadied generations, stepped forward with a slowness that made every elder present straighten their backs. His white hair caught the dim light, and his dark brown hands gripped the wooden lectern, as though anchoring himself for what he was about to reveal. He began with a whisper. "My beloved people, last night the island spoke. It spoke through thunder, through dreams, and through the memories of our ancestors." The congregation stilled. Even the restless children sensed something sacred settling over them. The Kingston elder lifted his eyes heavenward, as if listening again to the voice that had woken him in the middle of the night. He described his vision, a vast plain, not of Jamaica, but of red earth stretching far beyond the Caribbean horizon. A dust storm rising, not to choke or suffocate, but to awaken the forgotten bones of a long journey. The old preacher said the land felt ancient, carrying echoes of drums and the weight of battles fought long before the islands ever knew their own chains. And then, he said, a figure stepped forth from that red earth. Some in the chapel murmured. Others clutched their chests. Pastor Morgan continued, "I saw a young leader wearing courage like armor. His footsteps shook the dust. His eyes were not the eyes of a man newly risen. They were the eyes of someone carrying the breath of 1,000 ancestors." A woman in the second row whispered, "Africa." A man near the door replied, "A new generation." The Caribbean preacher nodded slowly, confirming their intuition without uttering a single name yet. He spoke instead of the meaning behind the vision, of nations longing to heal, of people scattered across oceans yet tied together by memory and struggle, of islands searching for dignity, and of elders who had spent long lives waiting for someone, anyone who reminded them of the fierce, unbroken spirit they once saw in the mirror. Then the island pastor revealed the second part of his dream. A trembling moved through the church as he described a river flowing between two distant shores. The water carried stories, old stories of rebellion, new stories of rebuilding, and silent stories the world had refused to hear. The river grew brighter, stronger, more defiant, until the two shores it connected began to pull toward one another. He paused. Someone in the front pew asked, "Pastor, What does it all mean? He leaned his weight upon the pulpit, voice deepening with gravity. It means the world is shifting, my children. It means the Caribbean is being called. It means that Africa is no longer standing alone. The choir director wiped tears from her eyes. A retired fisherman lifted his hands to the ceiling. Even the skeptics, those who had come only out of routine, felt a solemn trembling in their breath. Pastor Morgan finally spoke the name. The man I saw was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Gasps filled the sanctuary. For even in Jamaica, even among the older generation, stories had traveled. Stories of a young African leader standing against pressures that would have crushed others. Stories of courage stirring unlikely alliances. Stories whispered in barber shops and market stalls. And what you felt, the pastor continued, was not politics. It was not news. It was a moment of recognition. A bridge between the ancient and the rising. An Ibrahim Traoré moment that shakes the dust off our own forgotten strength. The island wind rattled the windows as though agreeing. But Pastor Morgan was not finished. He said the vision carried a warning, one that pressed heavily on his spirit. As he prepared to reveal it, he closed his eyes, gathering his breath, and the entire chapel held theirs. And then the elder said 8 words that froze every heart inside that room. But brothers and sisters, what I saw next will test the very soul of the Caribbean. Brothers and sisters, when the old Kingston pastor spoke those 8 trembling words, the atmosphere inside the chapel thickened like the humid air before a hurricane. Pastor Morgan placed both hands upon the pulpit, his chest rising slowly, as though he were carrying not only his own breath, but the breath of generations watching through the veil of time. I saw conflict, he murmured, not of guns, not of armies, but of conscience. The church leaned forward as one body. The Jamaican shepherd described how, in his vision, the young African captain walked through a field of broken promises. Papers lay scattered like fallen leaves, letters stamped with foreign seals, agreements signed without the people's consent, documents that smelled of the same old tricks that had once robbed islands and nations of their voice. He walked through them without bowing, the pastor said, and when he lifted one page, the wind rose. It blew the documents into the sky, as if heaven itself refused to let such things stand unchallenged. A few of the elders nodded knowingly. They had lived long enough to recognize the scent of manipulation even in symbolic dreams. The Caribbean minister continued, voice steady but charged. And I saw men from distant continents watching him, their eyes narrow, their whispers sharp. They asked, how does he defy what others accept? And the answer echoed back through the earth. Because the child of the ancestors cannot betray them. A murmur swept through the pews. The pastor was taking them deeper, further into the heart of his revelation. He told them how the vision shifted again. The African captain lifted a lantern. Its flame burned blue and gold, colors no islander had ever seen in fire before. As he stepped forward, the ground beneath him cracked open not in destruction, but in truth. From the crack rose the silhouettes of people who had long suffered in silence. Farmers, widows, laborers, miners, schoolchildren, entire communities forgotten by the world's noise. They followed him, the Kingston pastor whispered, not because he ordered them, but because they recognized something that had been missing for far too long. A woman near the aisle whispered, integrity. A man behind her added softly, courage. Pastor Morgan lowered his head, and I saw that courage ripple across oceans. First to the mainland, then across the Atlantic, and then, my children, it reached our islands. The chapel trembled again, as though the Caribbean itself had responded. I saw Jamaicans, the pastor said. I saw Trinidadians, Bajans, Haitians, Martinicans, Kitichans, all turning their faces toward Africa, not in longing, but in remembrance. The old church father's voice deepened, and that is when the adversaries grew restless. He described a shadow drifting across the vision, figures in suits, smiles that did not reach the eyes, voices masked behind diplomacy. They gathered around a map marked with coastlines, mining sites, shipping routes, tiny islands, and vast deserts. Their fingers moved swiftly. Their whispers grew urgent. And every time they circled those lands, the Caribbean minister said, the lantern of the young captain grew brighter, as if refusing to be overshadowed by intentions hidden in the dark. A hush fell. Then Pastor Morgan said something that startled even the boldest among them. In my vision, the captain turned his head slightly, as if he felt the weight of the world questioning him. And in that moment, I saw the Ibrahim Traoré reaction, not of anger, not of fear, but of a man who knows he has already paid the price for truth. The word truth rang through the chapel like a bell. People clutched each other's hands. Some trembled, some wept. Even the stoic elders stared ahead with watery eyes, as though decades of frustration had suddenly found language. The Jamaican shepherd continued. When he stepped forward again, one island lit up before the others. And that island was ours. Gasps, hands over mouths, eyes widened. Why Jamaica? Someone cried, breaking the silence. Pastor Morgan slowly raised his face. Because our ancestors left a doorway open, and what steps through it next will change the spirit of the Caribbean. The entire room went still, for they knew the pastor was about to reveal the part of the prophecy that had shaken him to his core. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a near whisper. But hear me now, children, for what came after was so heavy I prayed twice before deciding to share it. He paused. The chapel held its breath, and the island wind fell completely silent. For in the next vision, the Caribbean pastor saw a warning that could tear nations apart. Brothers and sisters, when the Caribbean pastor finally gathered enough strength to reveal the third part of his vision, a heaviness rolled through the chapel like a slow wave. Even the candles seemed to shrink their flames, as though bracing for what was about to be spoken. Pastor Morgan pressed one palm over his heart. In the next vision, he said quietly, I saw consequences. Not for one nation, but for all of us who share the memory of chains, exile, and resilience. A trembling passed through the room. The Kingston elder described how the earth beneath the African captain cracked again. This time not to reveal forgotten people, but to expose forgotten wounds. Wounds the Caribbean had buried beneath music, laughter, and survival. Wounds the diaspora had carried silently across oceans. Wounds elders had whispered to each other, but seldom named aloud. I saw islands arguing, the pastor continued, not with fists but with pride. I saw leaders losing their way, choosing comfort over conviction, applause over service. I saw foreign advisors standing beside them, not to guide but to distract. A bitter sigh rose from the pews. Many elders had lived long enough to recognize when a leader had lost their soul. And I saw fear, the Jamaican shepherd murmured. Fear dressed up as logic. Fear disguised as diplomacy. Fear that made strong men bend and brave women doubt themselves. He stepped away from the pulpit, pacing slowly, his sandals brushing against the worn wooden floor. But the deepest wound, he said, was not the leaders, but the people. He described crowds on Caribbean shores, Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Bajans, Grenadians each caught in a storm of confusion. Some felt hope rising, others felt old bitterness resurfacing. Generations collided, the youth impatient, the elders weary, and the middle-aged too tired to choose a side. And that, the Caribbean pastor said, is when the dark cloud descended. The room stiffened. The old church father described the cloud as a swirling mass of doubt and division. It hovered above the islands, whispering lies into the ears of the people. You are too small. You are too divided. You are too late. You do not deserve unity. Some elders shook their heads fiercely, as though rejecting those whispers in real time. The pastor lifted his hand. Hear me now. The cloud did not come from our people. It was pushed towards us. It came from those who profit from our confusion, who grow wealthy from our distrust, who sleep well only when the children of the diaspora are arguing among themselves. A low, angry rumble traveled through the congregation. The emotion he had stirred in Task 1 returned anger, sharpened by exhaustion, wounded by history. But Pastor Morgan was not finished. He said the cloud tried to dim the lantern of the African captain, tried to blur the connection between Africa and the Caribbean, tried to make the islands believe they were isolated and insignificant. But every time the cloud grew darker, a new light emerged from the diaspora in America, from elders in cities like Atlanta, Baltimore, Chicago, and Detroit. I saw African-American elders rising, the island preacher said. Grandmothers speaking truths they had hidden for decades. Old church deacons reminding their communities of who they truly were. Retired activists recalling sacrifices made in the name of dignity. The people in the Jamaican chapel nodded with reverence. Many had relatives in those cities. And from that remembering, the pastor said, a new tide formed, a tide of solidarity, a tide of clarity, a tide of healing between people who had forgotten they still belonged to one another. The chapel exhaled as though a burden had lifted. But children, Pastor Morgan added, healing is only possible if we recognize the danger, if we see the cloud for what it is, if we do not allow the fractures of the past to shape the future. He paused, looking at every face in the room. So I ask you, and I ask every listener across the diaspora, across the oceans, across the generations, his voice softened to a trembling whisper. Do you believe the Caribbean is ready for a spiritual awakening? Or will the old wounds speak louder than the new calling? The congregation held its breath, and then the pastor closed his eyes. For in the next vision, he said, I saw the world watching, and their eyes were not filled with kindness. What those eyes revealed will shake you, my children, in ways you do not expect. Brothers and sisters, when the Jamaican shepherd opened his eyes again, a solemn hush swept across the chapel. The candles flickered as though a new presence had entered the room. Pastor Morgan steadied himself, gripping the pulpit with both hands, and his voice grew quieter, heavier, as he carried the prophecy into its fourth turning. In the next vision, he said, I saw not our islands, but the world. The congregation leaned forward. The Kingston elder described a vast table made of cold steel, surrounded by officials from nations far beyond the Caribbean Sea. Their suits were crisp, their expressions firm, their voices muted, yet sharpened by ambition. Maps lay before them, maps of Africa, maps of the Caribbean, maps of trade lanes, mineral belts, energy corridors, and shipping routes marked in red ink. Their eyes, the island preacher whispered, were not the eyes of friends. He saw analysts in Washington murmuring over satellite images. He saw European commentators making predictions, some with concern, others with calculations. He saw diplomats drafting statements crafted to look gentle but carrying the sting of pressure. He saw think tanks describing the rise of new leadership as uncomfortable, unexpected, or requiring containment. And every time the unity between Africa and the Caribbean grew stronger, the Jamaican shepherds said, their faces tightened, as if the old order were slipping from their grasp. But the vision did not stop at political rooms. Pastor Morgan saw living rooms in America, particularly in the homes of African American elders. Families gathered around televisions and mobile phones, watching clips from across the ocean. Some leaned forward with pride. Some whispered prayers. Some felt something stirring that they had not felt since the marches of the 1960s. I saw elders in Chicago, he said softly. I saw pastors in Atlanta. I saw grandmothers in New Orleans lifting their hands as if recognizing an echo from long ago. The congregation nodded. Many had cousins, siblings, or children living in those cities. And I saw the youth of the diaspora, the old church father continued, scrolling through their screens, confused by the mixed messages. Some were inspired, some were skeptical. Some asked, is this real change, or just another moment the world will attempt to erase? He stepped back from the pulpit, pacing slowly. But beyond America, he added, I saw the world's media turning their cameras not to amplify hope, but to shape the narrative. Voices narrated fear, headlines emphasized division, commentaries predicted instability, and the pastor saw how the world attempted to frame the rising connection between Africa and the Caribbean as a threat rather than a healing. It reminded me, he said, of how the civil rights movement was reported, how the Windrush generation was spoken about, how every step towards dignity has been shadowed by voices who fear the power of unity. The chapel murmured with bitter agreement. Pastor Morgan raised a single finger. But hear me now, children. The world's reaction is not the danger. The true danger is how we respond to it. His voice trembled, carrying centuries of memory. For in the final part of my vision, I saw a path narrow, shining, dangerously steep, and only those who walk with courage, clarity, and conviction will be able to step upon it. He leaned closer, his whisper electrifying the room. And what lies at the end of that path shook even me, for the pastor saw a future calling, so powerful and so demanding that it could either lift the Caribbean into its destiny or break it beyond repair. Brothers and sisters, by the time the Kingston elder stepped into the final part of his revelation, the entire chapel sat frozen, as though the building itself had chosen to breathe with them. Pastor Morgan let the silence settle, allowing every heart to steady itself before the next truth was delivered. His voice, when it returned, was softer than before, yet carried a weight that pressed upon every soul present. In the last vision, he said, I saw a path, not wide and comfortable, but narrow, steep, and shining with a light that did not come from this world. The congregation leaned in. The island preacher described the path stretching between two distant shores. One shore was the Caribbean, vibrant yet wounded, weary yet unbroken. The other was Africa, rising with a strength the world had underestimated for far too long. Between them lay a bridge knot of stone, not of steel, but of memory, sacrifice, and spiritual inheritance. And I saw our people, the Jamaican shepherd continued, standing at the foot of that bridge, hesitant. He spoke of the elders first, Caribbean grandmothers who had buried children, Jamaican veterans who had marched for dignity, Trinidadian teachers who had spent decades shaping the next generation. He saw them stepping forward with slow, careful movements, not because they lacked courage, but because they understood the weight of the journey ahead. I saw elders becoming the flame, the old church father said, passing down stories that had nearly been lost, reminding the youth that strength does not begin in muscles, but in memory. Then he described the younger generation. Some stepped forward boldly, driven by passion. Others lingered at the edge, fearful of carrying a legacy they felt unprepared for. Some were distracted by the noise of the modern world. Some were paralyzed by doubt. And yet, the Caribbean pastor murmured, the path did not move. It waited, as if saying, I will not unfold until you decide who you wish to be. The pastor then spoke of nations, Jamaica finding its voice again, Barbados rewriting its identity, Haiti remembering a revolution the world tried to bury, smaller islands realizing they were never truly small, Africa extending a hand not in superiority, but in kinship. But the path, he said, demanded something more. It demanded unity, not the unity of slogans, but the unity of shared purpose. He lifted his head, his eyes glistening. I saw churches opening their doors not only for prayer, but for dialogue. I saw families reconnecting with relatives far across the sea. I saw African American elders standing as bridges between continents. I saw Caribbean ministers preaching courage. I saw African leaders calling for dignity, and the more they reached for one another, the brighter the path became. But then his voice lowered. Children, hear me well. At the end of the path, I saw a moment of choice, a moment that will come to every island, every home, every elder, every youth. The chapel did not move, and that moment, the Jamaican shepherd whispered, will determine whether this generation walks into liberation or repeats the sorrow of its ancestors. He stepped back from the pulpit, trembling. For the future calling I saw was so powerful, it could lift the Caribbean into its destiny, he paused, or break it beyond repair. And the final words of the prophecy are heavier than any the pastor had spoken before. Brothers and sisters, as the final echoes of the prophecy settled over the chapel, Pastor Morgan lowered himself slowly onto the front pew. The island elder looked not tired, but emptied like a man who had poured out everything entrusted to him. A soft breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of salt and the far-off murmur of the Caribbean Sea. It was as though the island itself wished to sit beside him, to listen, to remember. The Jamaican shepherd looked up at the congregation and whispered, "A storm is coming, but so is the sunrise." Those words lingered in the room, floating like lanterns over water. He recounted the vision one last time, not to frighten, but to awaken. The world shifting, the islands stirring, Africa rising with a voice that refused to bow. Caribbean elders rediscovering their strength, diaspora families reaching across oceans to reclaim a memory that colonial history tried to erase. The question is not what the world will do, the Kingston preacher said. The question is what we will do. He reminded them of the bridge made of memory, sacrifice, and spiritual inheritance. He reminded them that unity begins in the home, in the chapel, in the quiet conversations between generations. He reminded them that no foreign power could ever suppress a people who remember who they are. And then he spoke of identity, of dignity, of the sacred moment when a community recognizes itself again after generations of silence. That, he said softly, is the true Ibrahim Traoré moment when courage becomes contagious, when history becomes a mirror, and when our people finally see their reflection with clarity. The congregation nodded, some with tears, some with trembling shoulders. And the world will give us many distractions, the Caribbean pastor continued. They will try to dissect every Ibrahim Traoré reaction. They will analyze, criticize, and speculate. But none of that matters as much as what we choose to become. The old church father lifted his hands. My children, the islands cannot afford sleep. Africa cannot walk alone, and the diaspora cannot remain divided. The prophecy is not a prediction, it is an invitation. He leaned forward, his voice falling to a tender whisper. So I ask you, do you feel the calling of this hour? Do you feel the tide shifting beneath our feet? Do you believe the Caribbean is ready for a new Ibrahim Traoré momentone, born not in visions alone, but in our own decisions? Silence. Then the people breathed as one. Brothers and sisters, if this message stirred something deep within you, do stay with us. Leave your thoughts below. And do share this with another elder who carries the memory of our people. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And the journey before us begins with you.